Good morning, everybody. I'm Bill Fulton, the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research here at Rice University. Welcome this morning to our program on preserving affordable housing, especially here in Houston and Harris County. For the last several months, we at the Kinder Institute, with the generous support from JPMorgan Chase, have been working on a research project highlighting issues associated with affordable housing preservation in Houston and Harris County. I'm going to make a presentation to you now in a minute. I'll summarize the results, and then we're going to have a panel discussion with three wonderful panelists: Mary Lawler from Avenue here in Houston, Liz Mueller from UT Austin, and Ralphine Caldwell, who's with the Local Initiative Support Corporation in Charlotte, which is highlighted in the report. So let me talk a little bit about the affordable housing situation in Harris County. And again, I want to acknowledge the generous support of JPMorgan Chase in sponsoring and working with us on this report. I'm going to make, there we go. So here's some overview lay of the land facts about the situation. Harris County residents are extremely dependent on housing that is affordable to them. As we're going to see, most affordable housing in Harris County is not publicly owned, it's privately owned. It's what is sometimes known as naturally occurring affordable housing, commonly known as NOAA. That is to say, it's privately owned, usually rental apartments. And what we found in the course of this study, doing this study, is that both NOAA and subsidized affordable housing are at risk. So here's a really startling chart that shows you that the vast majority of affordable housing in Harris County is naturally occurring. On the right-hand side, you see that that housing that is affordable to moderate and low-income people, more than 300,000 of those units are privately owned. Only about 50,000 are subsidized in some way by a federal program, whether that's a low-income housing tax credits, vouchers, or something like, or traditional public housing. So the vast majority of affordable housing in Harris County, the vast majority is naturally occurring. And it is our belief, although I'm not sure we have numbers in the report on this, that Harris County, because Houston traditionally discouraged public housing, is more dependent on privately owned, naturally occurring affordable housing than other cities. The other thing to point out about this naturally occurring affordable housing is it's getting old. This chart shows you the annual housing production in Harris County for the last 70 years. And if you look at where those spikes are in the late 70s and early 80s, right before the big oil bust in Houston, that is when most apartments were built, and most of the naturally occurring affordable housing consists of now affordable apartments that were built during that period. So as I always like to say, much of our affordable housing consists of apartments that were built 40 years ago with the intent of being torn down 20 years ago. Some of it's not in very good shape. In addition to that, this naturally occurring affordable housing is not in the best location for transit. Most NOAA units are located in between the Loop and the Beltway in locations that are far from jobs without access to good transit. So the challenges we see for naturally occurring affordable housing is that a majority of naturally occurring affordable housing units are of average or below average quality. And it's not clear who can pay for the improvements. As they go down market and as they become more vulnerable and more at risk and lower quality, it is unclear whether or not private apartment owners can pay to improve them while still ensuring that those rents are low. Existing programs and funds are more for new home construction, not existing home rehabilitation, which means that the upkeep needs of naturally occurring affordable housing are not being met. Now let's turn to, so that's NOAA. Now let's turn to federally subsidized programs. Now it's interesting, and which is constitutes basically virtually all of our officially deed restricted low or otherwise assured low and moderate income housing in Houston. I said there are about 50,000 units. This is a somewhat collapsed chart, but what it shows you is that the vast majority of those units were created through federal low-income housing tax credits, sometimes called LIHTC. You can see that Section 8 vouchers and public housing are relatively minor compared to LIHTC. There is a robust low-income housing tax credit industry in Houston that is producing more units all the time. So the vast majority of affordable units are privately owned. Among those that are subsidized in some way, the vast majority of them were created in new projects through low-income housing tax credits. Now, the publicly assisted housing is more centrally located. It's more likely to be in a better location. If you look at this map, I'm going to toggle back up to that other map. You can see the difference. If you look at particularly the big red dots, that is where the privately owned naturally occurring affordable housing is. And you see it especially on the west side along 59, on both sides of 59, between the Loop and the Beltway, and even all the way out to Highway 6. By contrast, you see that the subsidized housing is much more likely to be in affordable in a transit-friendly central location, closer to transit and close to jobs. Yet still quite a way. Still, there's quite scattered throughout the county. So challenges for the subsidized housing. Number one is low-income housing tax credits are not permanent. Those projects typically are 15 to 30 years. And then there becomes the question of how do you preserve the affordability of those projects once that 15 to 30 year goes by. Other federal subsidies, such as public housing and vouchers, depend on annual federal appropriations, which are pretty reliable, but are certainly not growing. Just to give you an example, this is the low-income housing tax credit expiration dates in Harris County. You can see that particularly in the 2030s, starting about 10 years from now, we begin to see an enormously big problem with the low-income housing tax credits expiring and a concern about how we retain the affordability of those units. So that's the lay of the land. That's what we see as the problem. Now, what can we do? And I'm going to talk, I have a couple slides here, big bullet points about steps we can take, and then I'm going to turn it over to our panel to talk about things that can be done and what are being done. One is we don't know where the LISC lies, particularly for privately owned housing. We don't have any data about that really, other than what you've seen. We don't know how risky it is. We don't know how likely they are that the naturally occurring affordable housing is to go away. We can anticipate the lapsing affordability of publicly assisted rental housing, as you see here. You see the big looming LIHTC problem. There is a problem of that no one agency is in charge of this. There are many, many different public agencies that play a role here. How do you coordinate them? One strategy that we found is possible and likely is that we can support the development of shared equity models such as a community land trust, which we have in Houston, which allows ownership opportunities for those of low and moderate income by splitting the equity with an entity such as a community land trust. So the trust owns the land, and the homeowner owns the improvements on the land. Obviously, we may not be able to preserve all naturally occurring affordable housing. So therefore, one strategy would be to make sure that the NOAA preservation that we do focus on lies in key locations, along key transportation corridors, near job centers actually, and in rapidly gentrifying areas. We can also identify new funding sources such as foundations, anchor institutions to provide capital to support both NOAA and subsidized housing preservation. One possibility is for government loan guarantees, that conceptually easy to think about, difficult to implement. And it may be possible to assist owners of naturally occurring affordable housing, whether those are homeowners themselves or landlords, with tools such as tax abatements or exemptions and tax increment funds set aside for preservation. I'm going to go over those again. The data is a problem. We have to anticipate the lapsing affordability. We have to have better coordination among public agencies. We probably need to look seriously at shared equity models. We have to focus the preservation in key areas along near transportation and jobs and in rapidly gentrifying areas. We have to identify new sources of funding. And we need to see if there are ways that we can use tools such as tax abatements to assist owners, private owners of affordable housing. Those are just some of the things that we came up with and that we recommend as a part of this report. I'm going to stop my screen share now. I'm going to ask my panelists to come on. I have a question for this. So we have three people from three cities. Liz in Austin, although Liz has recently been doing a lot of work in Houston, and we appreciate that. Mary here in Houston, and Ralphine in Charlotte, but read the report. I'm curious from each of you, after reading the report, was there anything about our local affordable housing preservation challenges that seemed unusual or that surprised you? Or is this a pretty typical situation that you see around the country? I'm going to start with Ralphine simply because you're not in Texas.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. I would say that there wasn't, when I read it, I didn't think there was anything in the report that was unusual. We know that across the country, we have to have more focus in all of our cities on NOAAs and preservation. We don't want to get, for Charlotte, one of the things that we wanted to do with particularly with the Charlotte Housing Opportunity Investment Fund that LISC is managing, we wanted to make sure that we were not only building new construction rental housing, but that we were also preserving, because we didn't want it to be where we're building new and then the preservation piece kind of goes to the wayside, and that's not something we wanted to do. And I think for us, as we have moved forward and since we started overseeing the fund, we actually have more requests. We actually made a push that over half of our $53 million fund is being used for NOAA preservation. And so one of the things in your report that I found interesting and really agreed with is the fact that you can't do this alone, right? It's not just a city, not a county. It's you're gonna have to have some public-private partnerships to really drive this home in Houston. And I think that's what we've done in Charlotte. Do we still have a ways to go? We still have, Charlotte is about at 30, we have about 35,000 units of NOAAs in Charlotte right now. And we know that we're gonna have to make an extensive push here in the next year or two, particularly because COVID has, with COVID and driving prices up for building as well as preservation, we're gonna have to do really come to the table with a lot more ways that we can be able to preserve and keep those homes affordable.
Liz, what about from your point of view? Is this a pretty typical situation? Are there things that are unusual about Houston and Harris County here? And how do you assess the challenge we face here?
It isn't an unusual situation. It's that NOAA has been the main way that low-income people find housing that's remotely affordable to them across the country. I think what I was struck by in reading your report is how big the stock of NOAA is in Houston and Harris County. I mean, it's a big city and a big county. The trends nationally are that a lot of it is being lost, that there's been a tremendous decline in the stock of so-called, I hate this term, but naturally occurring affordable housing across the country, and that new construction is really bringing online units oriented to the high end. So it's really a critical issue to address right now. And if Houston still has a large stock of it, that is a really important opportunity. I think I was struck really looking at the report at the maps. I was really struck by what you just emphasized, that the tax credit and other publicly assisted housing is so much more centrally located than most of the NOAA. Although it did look like there was some that might have actually been entering that little arrow, the famous arrow in Houston that has
Yes.
managed to not have any subsidized housing in it. But so that's a big challenge. Like, obviously it's going to be challenging to try and acquire or partner or do anything with this housing. So being strategic and trying to identify things that are actually in good locations will be really important.
Yes, I think it's a good point, Liz, that we saw this huge apartment boom in the 70s and 80s, and that occurred mostly on the west side. This was undeveloped land at the time. It was market rate apartments. One of the things, Gulfton, which is an area with a lot of NOAA now, particularly for immigrants and refugees, started out being an apartment building, an apartment neighborhood for singles back in the 70s and early 80s, with swimming pools and all that. Completely different than today. So it's simply so that we are living off the endowment of that enormous number of apartments that were built at that time.
Yes.
Now, Mary, can you tell us a little bit about you've actually worked with JPMorgan Chase and others to try to stand up funds to actually acquire some of this NOAA or otherwise intervene. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and how it has been, how that has been either successful or frustrating?
Sure. So Avenue created a fund last year specifically for affordable housing preservation. And it has been quite challenging, to be honest, to purchase and preserve these properties. There is a lot of competition from investors. Many of these owners aren't particularly interested in selling to begin with. And even though we have the fund, which is essentially a subsidy for us to be able to purchase these properties, it's really hard for us to compete against other investors. There's a lot of money out there in the economy looking for a place to be, and real estate is seen as a good place to be. It's a safe investment. It is earning returns, and so it's quite difficult. The interesting thing that I found on the report, which has been touched on a little bit, was the distribution of the NOAAs geographically, and the fact that they don't tend to be near employment centers or transportation. And that's a challenge for us in terms of our objectives in the types of properties that we want to acquire, because we are looking for properties that do have good access.
Ralphine, is that similar to the experience you've had in Charlotte? You're nodding your head.
Yeah, absolutely. But for Charlotte, the NOAAs are, it's kind of a mix. You have some that are located near your jobs, your transit, grocery stores, healthcare, all of that. And then you have others that are not. So we kind of have a mix. But one of the things, the reason I was nodding my head is when Mary was saying, the competition for being able to purchase NOAAs, because it is competing. You have market rate investors. We have partners who really are, their goal and their focus is NOAA preservation. However, they might make an offer and it's, a market rate developer comes in, and next thing you know, their offer is no longer valid. So it is very, it is a struggle. But also what I would say is that when you're looking at funding and you're looking at trying to pull together funding for NOAA preservation, one of the things that I feel Charlotte has done a great job of is making sure that there is a separate process for that, for developers. And when I say developers, we have for-profit and nonprofit developers that are in that space, and making sure that it's a easy process for them. What I mean by easy is that because of the fact that they're putting in a bid for, putting in an offer for a NOAA complex, they really have to move very quickly. And for particularly our nonprofit partners, they're going to have to have access to that money really quickly. So what has happened is the city has a process that they can go through that is very quick, that is not the typical process that a developer would go through to receive funds, we overseeing the Charlotte Housing Opportunity Investment Fund, we also have a process where if a developer has a NOAA that they want to go ahead and purchase, they can go ahead and come to us. We can go ahead and talk about it. We can look at the numbers, and they don't have to go through the actual full RFP process. This was established when we started our fund, and has since been, and the city had started that already a while back, to ensure that we have a process in place that they can be able to use to be able to purchase them really quickly. So, because you got to move quick, otherwise they're not going to be able to, it's going to go to that market rate investor. And that's where I believe the problem has been.
And the market rate investor would typically either continue to allow the property to be run down, or would upgrade it in a way that would put the tenants at risk. Is that right? One of those two things. One of those two things.
One of those two things. They would either upgrade and raise the rents, or it may be better for them. They may be in an area of Charlotte that is with high amenities, as you mentioned kind of in your report. It could be an area where they're like, okay, we're going to hold on to this, but we know that, in 2 or 3 years, we might tear the whole thing down. And that's where we have, the displacement and all of that we really have to really be mindful of.
I think a critical on the NOAA, I think a critical question, and I know that Zoe Middleton put in on the chat the possibility of creating some sort of registry of landlords, but I think one of the questions is, who are the property owners? What motivates them? Are there a significant number of property owners who would be interested in tax abatements or other assistance to retain affordability if that were available, or is that just simply not something that most landlords and property owners are interested in? You're nodding, Liz. I'm just curious what you think about that. I'm going by who's nodding, in case you
I think that's a really good question. And in the national research, there's been a lot of attention paid to owners of smaller buildings, or owners of people who own fewer properties, as being more likely to be interested in those kinds of programs, or more in need of help making repairs and maybe willing to make that trade. But we really don't have a lot of good information about them. And that was one thing I wondered in the report. I didn't see a lot of detail in the breakdown about who owns these properties. So I wondered if you know.
I think part of the answer is that's a hard question to answer. We do have some information about institutional, not institutional, large REITs and others buying, and we have, that we have some anecdotal information about that, but we really do not have hardly any comprehensive information about who owns these properties. But I take your point that smaller property owners are perhaps more likely to be responsive than more large institutions.
Yeah, but that's the theory. But I think in the South, we tend to have much larger properties and more institutional owners. Although, I don't know if that's true in Houston, Harris County, but all of this there's very thin information on it. So it's kind of a theory.
Which is part of the reason we made the point that better data and better data sets are extremely important. And maybe the only way to do that, as Zoe Middleton indicated in the chat, is to have a landlord registry. I don't know whether that makes sense or not.
Yeah, I think that also links to another issue that I wanted to make sure that we talked about, which is the poor conditions in these buildings. And we know that we will have the resources to actually purchase and do something with a very small share of these buildings. And, you'll try and target the best kinds of locations in Houston and Harris County. But there's a lot of people living in those other buildings, and they're cheap because they're in bad conditions. Some of those conditions are health threatening. And the registry is sort of step one to being able to more systematically inspect them, look at the older buildings first or whatever, but have a more systematic approach to trying to see what those conditions are. And I think an interesting opportunity, or one of the things I really liked in the report, was sort of nobody's in charge right now. We need to bring people together to identify properties with particular problems, and that includes tenant advocates and other groups as well. And then we also need to bring together different agencies who work on parts of this. And part of it is the code inspection. Whichever part of your city is in charge of that, they're usually a totally different world. They don't really talk to the housing department. You know, there are resources for low-income homeowners who need help repairing their home, but when you have a NOAA building in bad condition, there isn't kind of a similar set of resources or strategies that the code department knows about or that even exists, you know? So I think they have to be brought in, and as do public health agencies who care a lot about the particular problems in these buildings that lead to asthma and other problems. So, yeah, and they also might be able to bring resources. So.
And we've seen a persistent problem in Houston since Hurricane Harvey of some of these buildings retaining, never having been the mold problem,
Yes.
never having been fixed after Hurricane Harvey.
Right.
One other question I had, I want to get to the audience questions in a minute because we currently have quite a few of them. But one other question I had, and I'll pose this, any of you can answer, but I'll pose it to Mary, is one of the problems that affordable housing developers have had in new construction is that the cost of labor and the cost of materials is going through the roof. If a nonprofit such as yours, Mary, seeks to buy and maintain or improve a NOAA building, let's say you buy one, and you're are these same problems impeding your ability to do that?
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic has definitely had a huge effect on our ability to find, you know, labor and materials for repairs. We have a repair going on right now where we can't get the windows. You know, we're trying to replace all the windows in a building, and they're not here yet. And so that's a big problem for us. And you know, in terms of the conditions of these properties, Liz touched on this already, but, you know, they're not the same type of stock as the low-income housing tax credit properties that many of the agencies, the city housing department is used to working with, which are essentially Class A type apartments with reduced rents. These NOAA properties are, you know, have very basic amenities and apartments, and as you said, Bill, they may be even smaller units because they were built for single people.
Right.
So, but they are still providing a tremendously important housing resource for a vast number of people in Houston, and so we do need to figure out a way to preserve them, whether that's through working with the existing landlords or finding a way to have the nonprofit sector acquire them.
Ralphine, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely we're seeing the same. Definitely the increase in construction cost on new build as well as for purchasing of NOAAs has significantly gone up. I was just in conversation with a developer only about 2 weeks ago, and the numbers that they gave us 6 months ago has gone up tremendously. And, you know, when we look at, and we're just talking construction costs, period. So that is definitely something that we're keeping an eye on. I think that that's going to have an effect on us as we are moving forward with our initiatives, new construction and NOAA in this next year. I do believe that, you know, when it comes to, you know, NOAA's, I mean, I think the thing that we had to realize, particularly in Charlotte, is that if we don't do anything, we're really not moving the needle, right? So, and I say that because Charlotte we've got about we're short for 30% AMI residents. We are short about 23,000 units. That number is not going to go down if we don't address, build more affordable housing, as well as address the NOAA situation as well, because if we don't do that, we're not going to move. And so and granted, we're not going to get out of that overnight either. So that's the reason that for Charlotte, you see that there was, you know, in the case study that you have in your report, you see that the public and private sector came together because we knew we had to come together in a big way. And that is the reason that all of the funds, from the Housing Trust Fund dollars being raised to 50 million to our fund, which is the Housing Opportunity Investment Fund of 53, and then you have the Housing Impact Fund that was also just recently started as of this last year to be able to really try to make a dent in our shortage in affordable housing.
I want to ask one more question before we go to the audience questions, and that's to Liz. Being kind of the policy wonk on the panel, Liz, you pointed out this problem of no one being in charge and there being many agencies and many entities. I'm just kind of curious your thoughts about who should be in charge if it is one entity, or how do you structure a useful conversation among all the players to make sure that as Ralphine said, the needle does get moved?
Thanks for that question. That's a really hard question. I don't know of an example where it's being done yet, but I do feel like, as I said before, we have the code department that is the one that's supposed to be aware of where the conditions are the worst. So the sort of health issues. We have public health agencies that are increasingly trying to develop interventions related to housing. We have transit oriented development type planning initiatives in most cities that are increasingly interested in housing as something supportive of what they're doing and thinking about equitable TOD, and they should be interested in retaining low-income renters near transit. So I guess housing, transportation, public health, and code enforcement, I think, are all involved, but they're probably under different assistant city managers. They don't think of themselves as related. Mm-hmm. So, that initiative has to come from up the hierarchy within the city to say we need to start thinking about how to coordinate these things. But it'll be very difficult. And the resources is always the limitation, because I know in my own work, I've tried to develop metrics that will help the city see where there's the potential for the most displacement. If they invest in transit or do other things, they do the analysis and then they say, now what do we do? So we need to be acting sort of before we get very far down that path. And that requires all that data, but it also requires the kind of funds that both Ralphine and Mary have talked about that bring in additional resources.
Mary and Ralphine, any further thoughts about structure and how you organize the players?
Well, I was just gonna. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ralphine.
Okay. I would say, not doing anything is not an option, right? So we have to, come together, city, government, public, private sector, all of that has to come together to be able to come up with a plan to be able to preserve housing. What I would say is that one of the things that we've been able to do in this past, that the city has done, is they actually have a NOAA rental subsidy program that was introduced as well, that actually provides for subsidy in NOAA complexes for that lower AMI percentage, 30% AMI percentage. That is also in addition to having funds and availability of funds for developers for purchase of NOAA units. Having a rental, some type of rental subsidy program might be an option as well for Houston. The city of Charlotte has done a great job with really kind of coming up with a policy, so to speak, guidelines that they now have when it comes to NOAAs. And they've been really, that has actually helped and has helped developers, but has helped us from our sector to really understand, what do we need to do, how we're going to move this forward, and really kind of having a plan here in the next, coming year.
Okay, let's move to some of the audience questions now. The first question actually, is about the question of providing financial assistance to landlords. What do you do, especially when and there's a reference to a particular situation in Vancouver where there's been some strife between a landlord family and the city. How do you make sure that if you provide assistance directly to landlords, say tax abatements, they actually maintain the property in a way that is beneficial to the tenants and to the overall NOAA situation? Mary, you're nodding.
Yeah, I think that's a big question because, you know, a lot of landlords of these properties do not want to be involved in government programs. They do not want to be accountable for, you know, the conditions of the property, for income verifying the tenants so that you know that you're really serving, you know, the population that you're meant to serve. And so I think that's a big challenge, and one thing that does point to the nonprofit sector a little more as part of the solution.
The next question from Steve Spillett, who's a well-known real estate market analyst here in Houston, is saying that unsubsidized NOAA multifamily is often a cash machine for the owners, and there's no incentive basically to upgrade the properties. How is there any way to alter that financial disincentive for reinvestment or to sell to a potentially more altruistic owner? Is there a way to bend the financial incentives in a way that's more beneficial to constructive NOAA preservation? I feel like I'm on Final Jeopardy and nobody knew the answer to the question. Yes, Liz.
I don't know if I know the answer to the question, but I'll take a stab at it, because we're having that problem in Austin where you know, investors will buy properties in areas that are gentrifying and just hold them, not improve them. They end up sometimes on our repeat offender property list, which is our one rental registry we have is for people with repeat code violations that don't do anything about them. And we have started now for that group, at least, if they hit a certain point, they're not allowed to rent out units as they become vacant, as long as they still have these violations. And that's the one thing that has gotten their attention and gotten them to make improvements. I think, you know, more severe enforcement of code will send a signal that the city's serious, and maybe future investors don't bank on not investing anything and just holding these properties. You know, I'm sure that won't be popular with them. And, you know, there always is this issue, oh, well, if they do the upgrades, they're going to raise the rent. So then maybe we think about, do we target rental assistance to properties that have done that? So the assistance goes to the tenant, not necessarily
not the landlord. Yeah, right. Right. Next question had two parts. One was whether these data sets we used in creating the report are available, and our staff responded to that, particularly particularly Steve Sherman's response. The answer is we use some publicly available data sets that will be up on our urban data platform. We use some proprietary data sets which we can't share. But the second question from this same audience member was whether there is any opportunity, so to speak, in the Opportunity Zone program that would incentivize owners to implement needed rehab to these properties. Any thoughts about that?
I can take a stab at that and just say that the Opportunity Zone program has not really shown itself to work that well with housing. It's not really meant for housing. I think it can be applied to housing, but it's not an easy fit. So I would say there are limits to that as a strategy. Yeah.
General agreement on that? Okay. Here's, I think, the fundamental question from Don Titcomb, which is, can we preserve our way out of the housing crisis? Are there policies we need? If 47% of the renters are cost burdened, aren't preservation models inherently falling short of addressing the problem? In other words, is there a supply problem? And if so, does preservation help solve that problem, or is it just a stopgap measure? Liz.
You keep giving me these hard questions. I would say the supply issue is part of the solution, but we're adding supply at the top, so that's not necessarily that effective. It's not going to filter down to the lowest levels where we really need it. At those levels, we really need higher wages and other things to prevent people from being cost burdened. That's a much bigger problem. We can't really solve income inequality and poverty through housing policy alone.
I think that's a very good point. It's a big, a lot of this is a bigger problem than just housing. Another question was, what current subsidies or tax breaks encourage affordable housing in Houston or other cities we can learn from? John Park on our staff noted that in Provincetown, Massachusetts, there's a tax exemption program for homeowners who allow low-income renters in their properties. Are there other models like that around the country that you all know about?
So, the state of Texas obviously depends quite a bit on property taxes for
Yes.
supporting the state and not on income taxes. And so property tax exemptions or abatements are hard to come by and have really been tightened up over the last decade or so, as opposed to being made more generous. But property taxes and insurance are the two biggest costs of operating rental housing. And so finding a way to reduce those costs for housing that is truly affordable would be extremely beneficial. So that, to me, would be a really great policy approach to tackling this problem.
And in fact, as you say, Texas governments are extremely dependent on property tax, and Texas property taxes are quite high. But for homeowners, for a variety of categories of homeowners, there are many exemptions or reductions, and perhaps that could be applied in this case. Another question is, what role green building, weatherization, water reuse systems, and other climate adaptation measures, what role do those play in preserving affordable housing?
I'll take a starting stab at that. We have a program in the state called PACE. I'm trying to remember what the acronym stands for right now. That is intended to help multifamily property owners be able to make weatherization and other energy efficiency improvements by basically, I think they're guaranteeing repayment based on the reduction in their energy bills over time. The challenge is that it doesn't, it also depends on properties, probably continuing to have rent increases. When I learned about that program, it was hard to see how it was a fit for affordable housing, but if there was intentional matching of rental assistance with that program, that might help with upgrading conditions of properties while ensuring that rents don't push people out.
Okay. Another question, which is not really about preservation, but about new construction. Will the city of Houston and Harris County make it public policy that any new apartment development must include a percentage of affordable housing? I'm not sure that's even allowed under Texas law. Mary, it's not, right?
It is not. Inclusionary zoning is specifically prohibited in the state of Texas.
So that's the answer to that question. That's a common technique in other parts of the country, but cannot be used in Texas.
You can incentivize it. Austin has a series of density bonus programs, and that's the way you get around it. You say, we will offer you voluntarily increased entitlements or other things, and in exchange, you set aside some housing.
That's a little hard to do in a city like Houston, where you don't have any zoning and you don't have any density restrictions.
Yeah, that's true.
This is a kind of philosophical question. I'm not sure what the right answer is, but this question from Michael Knight is, to what extent are market forces helping or hurting us in Houston in maintaining affordable housing? Mary, do you have a thought about that? Are the market trends good or bad for affordable housing generally?
So not good. So Houston, had this very long reputation as the most affordable city for housing in the country, and it's not true anymore, especially when we consider the costs of transportation here, which are quite high, since everybody pretty much needs a car to get around, especially if they live in those NOAAs that we saw that are far flung from anything else. So I think the market forces are not in our favor, and that we need to come up with policies to encourage preservation and creation of affordable housing.
There's a question about the Houston Metro upgrades in Gulfton. I think that's been well answered in the chat by Ann Whitlock. I would encourage you to read that. So I'm going to move on. One question is it possible to provide long-term affordable housing through some kind of Airbnb type model? Guess not.
Is perhaps the person who asked that is thinking for an existing low-income owner, they would be able to generate enough revenue to afford to stay as their property taxes rise. I've heard that argument made. Otherwise, there's also a lot of people studying how many units are being removed from the market through Airbnb. And I think finding that in particular parts of cities, especially very well located neighborhoods, that's becoming an issue.
Mm-hmm.
So those things that could be rental units or Airbnbs instead.
It's kind of so in fact, it's almost the opposite, right? It's almost the opposite. There's a question here from Tim Sullivan about his experience in volunteering in Harvey and finding them, and we saw this in the 3 floods we had in 3 years back in 15, 16, and 17. Many people were flooded repeatedly. We saw this, for example, in Greenspoint, where the neighborhood flooded 3 years in a row. How do we solve that problem of us? I can't remember the statistic, but in a previous report we did, we found that some very large percentage of NOAA is in the floodplain, and sometimes in Houston, even in the floodway. With that such a huge problem, how do you deal with the fact that so much of this NOAA, which people are dependent on, is actually in a dangerous location? Mary, any thoughts about that?
Well, and I know that some of those properties, especially in Greenspoint, were actually federally subsidized apartment complexes as opposed to NOAA's, and that for some reason the federal government kept providing funds to renovate them so that they could be flooded again. So to me, that is a easy solution. Is if a place has flooded repeatedly, you don't invest more public funds in it and you try and replace it someplace else.
A question. So I'm going to go to Liz with this because this is a big picture, impossible to answer question, which you specialize in. But are we just talking about patching a fundamentally flawed system for delivering housing? What would a system look like that ensured the availability of housing for the entire community? I mean, that goes back to partly back to the income question and so forth, right? But what would a more rational model look like?
Oh my God.
I decided to make your morning miserable. Liz.
Yeah,
Sorry.
well, I think a big part, this goes back to sort of the fundamental issue of what is housing a vehicle for investment or is housing shelter for people who live in it? Right. And it's both. But it's right now there's such a heavy weight toward the investment side that it's become a place where investors park their money. And it's become a commodity, as many people have noted, like other commodities where the owners of it don't even know where their properties are located, know nothing about them, have no incentive to maintain them. And, I think a lot of people very idealistically would say we should completely decommodify it. We should somehow break that link. Well, that's, probably highly unlikely to happen right now in Houston. But I think there can be things that we do to make it less profitable for people to be really bad owners. So we can focus on kind of people who don't repair their properties, allow them to be very dangerous places for people to live, and we make it not profitable for that to continue. That's one.
What would be an example of a strategy that basically discourages, does what you suggest?
Taking a property into receivership that gets to a certain point. So removing it from that owner, putting it in the hands of a preservation owner.
If it's in bad enough shape.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the issue is what's bad enough shape. I think if there was more sunlight on the conditions at some of these properties, there might be support for that, at least in the worst cases. Then the other thing is things like, having the land under certain properties be owned by a nonprofit or in other ways that can remove that tax burden. That's sort of taking it somewhat out of that market. All of, making a lot more of our housing in those kind of statuses just takes a lot of resources. But if we did that gradually, so we had a much larger share of our rental housing in these kind of third way forms of ownership, shared equity or land trust or things like that, that would remove a lot of it from that pressure.
And that was one of the questions down the pike here. Another question is whether NOAA is primarily rental apartments or ownership. And my recollection is from our study that the vast majority of naturally occurring affordable housing in Houston is rental apartments. Jim Tucker asked a question specifically of Mary. Mary, I know that Avenue is active in the near northeast side, which has drainage flooding issues dating back to Allison. When housing is or will be redone, will it be more resilient and able to recover from flooding without disaster?
Yeah, so definitely that's a challenge. I mean, reducing flooding risk is partially a city infrastructure question as opposed to something that an individual property owner can address. But where we can make adjustments on our property, that's definitely part of the improvements we want to make when we do acquire and preserve one of these complexes.
Okay. Does anybody happen to know whether the infrastructure bill contains funds to expand or rehabilitate affordable housing inventory? That's a question.
The Build Back Better proposal as of last week had $150 billion for housing. And the devil will be in the details, but I think a lot of it had the word rehabilitation in it. So I would hope that it would be easier to find federal funds to support that than it has been in the past.
Okay. There's a question about microfinance institutions, and actually we had a question that I didn't get to about whether or not crowdfunding, microfinance, anything like that can play a role in preserving affordable housing, or whether it's just too big a problem for that layer of financing.
I think when you're talking about crowdfunding, you'd have to really, that would have to be extensive fundraising in order to be able to do that. So I would not think that would be probably the most effective way to be able to preserve housing. But Mary or Liz could add to that if there's something that, that we may not be doing here in Charlotte.
Yeah, agreed. I hadn't thought of that as a strategy. I wouldn't rule it out, but it does seem like a more complex approach.
We have time for one more question. It's 3 before the hour. And so I'll throw this last question at you. Is one person asks, does shaming slumlords work? And are they incentivized to make improvements when they are publicly shamed? Or are bad acting landlords simply shameless?
I'll try. I sit on the Building and Standards Commission in Austin, so I see sort of the worst examples. The problem is identifying the owners. A lot of these are a collective, REIT or whatever, and it's very hard to put an actual face on an owner, and who they bring to the hearing is a lawyer or somebody else. So I agree. I saw that Zoe just posted enforcement is better than shaming. Yeah, I do think that public support for enforcement would be elevated by people seeing, not necessarily shaming individuals, but seeing the conditions and really highlighting what led to them. That helped here in gaining more support for spending funds on tenant organizing and on code enforcement and other things after a balcony fell off a building, and it proved incredibly difficult to find the owners. And we discovered thousands of violations have been posted against this building with really no enforcement.
And that goes back to the question you posed, and we found this in our previous work too. Running down who the landlords are if they're institutional is very, very hard. very hard,
Yeah.
and which is, I think, part of the reason why Zoe Middleton in her chat advocated for a landlord directory. Okay, well, thank you very much, Ralphine, Liz, Mary. Thank you very much for participating in our panel today. I again want to thank all of you for tuning in. This Zoom is recorded. You can look at the web. You can go to our website and read the report. And I also want to once again thanks JPMorgan Chase for supporting the creation of this report. The next Kinder Institute event will be on December 1st, when we will hear parking guru Donald Shoup talk about better parking policies that make possibly more sense, more economic sense than current policies. So again, thanks very much. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. We have them all. We'll circulate them to the members. And again, thanks to our panelists and thanks to all of you for tuning in today. So long.